Andrew.
Well, some of my people at the Institute for Government already want to do some work on how coalitions collapse. I think it's a bit premature. I'm assuming Thursday will be okay. But I do have some fellow feeling for Vince Cable, because I was in at the creation on the last student fees reform, which you'll remember the government's majority then, this was the Blair majority, whatever it was, 100 and something in the House of Commons, fell to 3. And it would have been 1, but for Robert Jackson, who was a Tory who voted with us on the grounds that, as he told me, of course, this is a thoroughly conservative policy, and my whole party will be supporting this within 5 years, which of course turned out to be prescient. But that was an absolutely traumatic experience, one of the most difficult experiences, apart from Iraq, of being in government. And I shall never forget, in the 2005 election, going to speak on behalf of a friend who was standing in a university seat and sadly got defeated, and to try and make a bit light of his predicament at the beginning of this meeting, I said, on my tombstone will be engraved the words tuition fees. And somebody shouted out from the back, not soon enough. Vince, I think, may be contemplating a similar fate. Now, the thing about tuition fees, though, which is significant, and it goes to what Nick was just saying, is it's not the cut. See, the most significant thing that's happening in terms of the coalition's policy on higher education is not, in fact, the increase in tuition fees. It's the 80% cut in the teaching grant, which is what is necessitating the other changes, which is actually one of the biggest cuts in public spending anywhere, made on the judgment that it's possible to make this good by increasing the fee. But what is enraging a part of the middle class and the students isn't so much the cuts, it's the co-payment. And it's the fact that as part of the fiscal squeeze and coming to terms with the deficit, people are being asked to pay more. Now, when at the beginning Ben said that public services are off the agenda, in my view, public services are only off the agenda if the cuts don't lead to really sharp deteriorations in quality. If the cuts lead to sharp deteriorations in quality, then two things will happen. Firstly, the middle classes will start going private in larger numbers, as they did in the 70s and 80s. In fact, over the past decade, what's telling is not only those polls which you saw showing public confidence, but the numbers defecting, going private, despite huge increases in wealth and affluence, have remained constant. The proportion going to private education and going to private health, very little change over the course of the last 10 years. If the cuts start impacting seriously on the quality of services, you will get a big increase in numbers going private. This will build up huge resentment in the professional class, who will then, start, it'll be money down the black hole, all of their 70s and 80s critique of the public services will be there, and that will spread more widely, and you'll have a growing sense of crisis. And of course, the debate about co-payment will then spread much more widely. It will be a debate not just about whether you should be paying for tuition fees, but whether in fact GPs visits, certain types of education after school, all those things will come in. So how the cuts actually work and what happens in the public services is going to be a really critical issue over the next few years. And don't be put off the scent on this one by the NHS and some of the other areas being described as quote-unquote protected. The protection is, of course, relative. It means that they're not being subject to the cuts that other departments are being subject to, but 4% efficiency gains in the NHS a year. 4%, that has never been achieved. It has never been possible to manage the NHS within a financial settlement that has been announced for the next 4 years, so it's going to be very tough. Second point that strikes me about the presentation, Ben is obviously right. It's the economy stupid. And there are basically two arguments going on out there at the moment. Forget sort of Cameron and Miliband. There are two big political arguments going on. One is that dealing with the deficit in the way that the coalition is proposing is both necessary, which the polls seem to support, but also will not produce serious rises in unemployment and a big threat to growth. If that argument proves to be correct, then Cameron is onto a winner. If, in fact, though, the economy is sluggish, unemployment starts rising, growth doesn't return, then that whole strategy will be put in question, and when that strategy is in question, the political dynamics will come into play as well. Remember that before the 1983 election, a huge spurt of growth. It wasn't just that Thatcher managed to time her popularity because of the Falklands and all that. It was the economy stupid, as it was again with the Lawson boom. Final point I'd make is about the nature of the cuts, and it relates to this point about welfare. What's interesting, if you look at the Cameron-Osborne plan against the Brown-Darling plan, is that the big moving parts is whether welfare can take make big economies. The changes to departmental spending are not much different between the two plans, but there's a hugely bigger allowance for welfare changes in the coalition's plans. Now, at one level, that's popular. You know, my good friend James Purnell wishes he'd been given licence by Gordon Brown to do a lot of these reforms himself, and is saying so increasingly publicly at the moment. And clearly, this wasn't, priority number one as a reform agenda for Labour in power. And there isn't much sympathy amongst the electorate for scroungers and all that, particularly at a time of austerity. The big acid test here, though, is whether it works. You know, you've got this universal credit, you've got really radical changes taking place to pretty well every welfare benefit going, and then them all being glued together by IDS in this new thing called a universal credit, which has been the dream of policy wonks for decades, to make a single integrated benefit work. In the past, every time anyone has really looked at it seriously and tried to make it work, it's not just that they've sort of ducked it politically, but it is very difficult to make work. You've got issues to do with constant means testing and all of that. I'm told by my friends who know that now that tax changes, payments of tax are being notified as of the beginning of the year after next monthly, as opposed to where it is every 6 months. It is possible to run a benefit like this without constant notification, so it may be technically possible. But in my view, a good part of the fate of the coalition, in terms of its cut strategy, will depend upon whether it can carry through welfare cuts, not only which in principle appeal to the public, but actually work in practice. Because whilst it's true that one of the lessons that they draw from the Blair years is that your big reforms you should start immediately, the IFG, the Institute for Government, published a survey of the most successful policies of the last 30 years last week. 3/4 of those policies were started within months, if not days, of a government taking office, so that as a general recipe is right. Nonetheless, it is generally a good thing if your big reform programmes work as opposed to don't work. Where they don't work, then grief does follow. And I think what happens on these welfare reforms, and in particular whether this thing which most people haven't even heard of at the moment, but which is going to be a massive change over the next 3 years, the introduction of the universal credit, whether that does succeed in getting welfare spending down sharply without people sleeping rough on the streets, without a huge sense of crisis in cities, particularly inner cities nationwide, and without the thing technically, you know, with all the computer systems and all that collapsing in chaos. If IDS can pull that off, then I think a good part of this deficit reduction strategy will be credible. If he can't, and the growth strategy doesn't work, then I think the government will be hugely vulnerable, and it may be very unpopular, and then not come out of it at the end. Those are my reflections on your presentation.